Today I have something pretty interesting and unique to show you guys. What I have right here is the winter trigger assembly for the M1 Garand rifle. If you aren't familiar with these, you may be wondering why you need a different trigger to use in the winter time. The point of these was just to make it easier to fire the rifle if you were wearing gloves or mittens. The US Army adopted the M1 Garand just before World War II started, but as far as I can tell, these winter triggers weren't created until the Korean War. This was kind of a rare occurrence where I couldn't find too much information about the history of these things, but today I want to show you guys what I was able to find and show a demonstration of how you'd actually install this on a rifle and use it. In my opinion, I think these are pretty neat and I'm glad that I have one now, but they can also be pretty dangerous to actually use on a rifle, and I'll show you why a bit later. So here's a closer look at that winter trigger assembly, but as you can see, this thing is straight from the factory and it is covered in cosmoline. Look at this right here. It was typical during World War II for metal parts like this to be covered in cosmoline for shipping. If you're not familiar with cosmoline, it's basically just a waxy oil, and that was to protect metal parts like this during shipment. It's also notorious for being pretty difficult to clean off of rifles and stuff, so I'll try to clean this off in a minute. My fiance's grandfather was actually a World War II veteran. He was a company clerk, so he didn't see combat or anything. But one time when I was talking to him before he passed, he told me a story about how the rifles would be shipped with this cosmoline all over them. And that one time a group of guys from his outfit were cleaning off rifles in some kind of building in England. And I guess the furnace in that room caught the cosmoline and the cosmoline soaked rags on fire and killed a small group of soldiers from his company. Not really relevant, but I just wanted to throw that in there since I think it's an interesting bit of history. It just goes to show that many of the guys who weren't fighting on the front lines still had to face the death and destruction of war in different ways. Alright, I got this nice and cleaned up with just some boiling water and dish soap, and now it's ready to go on the rifle. So if we look at my M1 Garand here, we can see the trigger guard right here, and that's what's actually used to mount this winter trigger. Now there were two different types of trigger guards used. This one right here is the earlier milled trigger guard, and then this is the later stamped version. As you can see, the easiest way to tell the difference between these two at a glance is this hole in the milled trigger guard. They could be a little bit stiff, and since you have to pull it back to unlatch it to take the trigger group out, they put this hole in there so you could put like a screwdriver or something through there to get a little bit of leverage when you're pulling back on it like that. The later stamped guards are a little more pliable and forgiving, so they didn't need to have this loop put on them to help with unlatching. I bring that up because, as you'll see in a minute here, the winter trigger actually uses this hole to mount on the old type of trigger guard and has an adapter that can be used to mount it on the newer type of trigger guard. At the time when they started making these winter triggers, these stamped trigger guards were already very popular, but many of these old milled guards were still in use, so the winter trigger had to be able to work with both. I've heard some people guess that that hole was put there just for the winter trigger, and that's not true because these milled guards were made way before these winter triggers. So in theory, installing this on the rifle should be as simple as just lining this hole up and then pushing it into place. Looks like I will need to actually pull the trigger to get it all the way in. Of course, make sure you check to make sure you have an empty chamber before doing this. There you go. It may have been easier to install this by just opening up the trigger group, but as you saw, it went on just fine without doing that. Alright, so now that we have it installed, you can see how this works. It just makes it so you don't have to put your finger inside the trigger guard to actuate the trigger like that. You may also be starting to notice why I said this was a dangerous invention. The whole point of having a trigger guard on your rifle is to guard the trigger, and this completely bypasses that. Obviously, for soldiers in extreme cold temperatures, being able to fire their rifle was probably the biggest priority, but you had to take extra caution with this exposed trigger here. I mean, if I just go to grab the rifle normally, I could easily end up pulling the trigger by accident, especially if I have thick mittens on and can't feel that I'm pulling the trigger. So maybe not the safest design, but cool nonetheless. So now I'm going to pull this off and show you how this winter trigger would work with the adapter I mentioned for the stamped trigger guard. This adapter here slides right onto the winter trigger like that. And you can see that if this stamped guard were mounted there, instead of pushing that peg through the hole like I showed, you would simply open up that trigger guard and then slide it right through this adapter And then you have the same functionality that we just saw on the milled trigger guard. Let me demonstrate why that winter trigger was necessary in the first place. Hold up, slow down there, past version of me with a fresh haircut. We'll get into that demo in just a second, but first let me take a quick second to tell you about Praecidus Watches, the sponsor of this video. Praecidus is a company that makes watches based on vintage military styles like the A11 and A5 watches. They have a huge variety of watch styles and bands available on their website, so click the link in the description to check them out. And when you find the watch that's right for you, use code WWW for 10% off your watch purchase over $50. Whether you're a World War II reenactor like me looking for a period accurate timepiece, or just somebody who wants a well-made watch in a classic style, click that link in the description and I'm sure you'll find something you like. Oh, and now that that's out of the way, quick disclaimer. I was using a bit of a different camera setup when I first filmed this video, and some of the framing kind of leaves something to be desired. So don't be alarmed by the fact that the top of my head is like totally cut off frame in this next section. You can just imagine that my head is like sticking out of the top of your phone or computer or something if that helps, but it is what it is. Alright, me from the past, let's see that demonstration. You can see with the glove on my hand, it's a bit difficult to get my glovey finger inside the trigger guard, and it's even more difficult with the safety on. There's just not a lot of room to fit in there. This could easily lead to somebody squeezing off around accidentally while they're trying to get their finger in there, or just not being able to get to the trigger when they need to. Once I put the winter trigger on there though, you can see that I have easy access to it from outside the trigger guard. This should also make it clear why this was dangerous though, because I could easily just bump the trigger on something and have it go off. They also made winter triggers similar to this for the BAR, M1 carbine, and maybe even some other weapons. There was also a later version of the winter trigger called the M5. I believe that one was adopted in 1962, and that one could mount to either the M1 Garand or the M14. The M5 version actually needs to be screwed into the stock. I guess that was done so it could work on both rifles, but that seems like a bad system to me. It also looks like it's set up so that you squeeze it with your whole hand at once, which makes it seem even more dangerous and likely to cause negligent discharges because just bumping it with your hand could set it off. I haven't actually used one of those myself though, so I could be wrong about that. You can also tell that if I had a glove or mitten on, it'd be really difficult to access this safety right here. For those later winter triggers, they were often issued in a kit along with a winter safety. That winter safety, like you see in this picture, has a kind of protruding lever, and you can use that to turn the safety on and off without putting your finger inside the trigger guard. But as far as I can tell, they weren't issuing those winter safeties until they came out with that later version in the 60s. I don't think those would have been around during the Korean War since it seems like those were issued as a set. But if you have more information on those winter safeties, let me know in the comments. I tried to find some information about how often those winter triggers were used, but I couldn't find any great sources. I've heard some people say that because those winter triggers were dangerous, they were almost never used, and that the US Army even destroyed a bunch of the winter triggers for the M1 carbine because they were dangerous. But I don't know how true that is, and that doesn't make a ton of sense to me, considering that they did make that later version of the winter trigger called the M5. So why would they bother making a new version of the winter trigger that worked with their new rifle, the M14, if they weren't using them for the M1 Garand in the first place? As always, if you have more information on that, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to learn more about how these things were used. So like I said earlier, I don't think the US was issuing winter triggers during World War II, but that doesn't mean that nobody was using them. The Germans actually had winter triggers for a bunch of their weapons, including the K98K, MP40, K43, and even the MG43 and 42. I would guess that the development of this winter trigger for the M1 Garand was heavily influenced by those German winter triggers. I couldn't find sources saying that exactly, but I don't think it's a far leap to make that assumption. Well, that about wraps it up for this video. I hope you guys were able to learn something through all that. I apologize for some of the weird camera angles and lighting. I'm trying a bit of a new setup. Hopefully that wasn't too triggering for any of you. But with that being said, make sure you're subscribed to World War Wisdom for more military history content, and I'll end this video with the obligatory M1 Garand ping. Nice. Thanks guys, and I'll see you in the next one.